Hello everybody. How's everybody doing this morning? Good? Tired? Just because it's 8 o'clock or? I'm feeling like surprisingly awake today. Like I feel like half the time when I come in at 8, and I hope you guys haven't noticed this, but I feel kind of like a zombie. Like this is early in the morning for me as well. Yeah, so today I'm raring to go. Okay, any questions about anything in the course? Assignments coming up, etc.
So I was wondering about the paper. Are you okay with like direct quotes?
Oh yeah.
Okay. And
I
like,
love quotes.
okay, so I don't know, like some teachers are like, oh, I really like quotes. Like, do you like them a lot, or are you just like, oh, just put it in like every once in a while?
Oh yeah, use quotes as much as you want.
Okay.
If you felt like somebody said it better, just take their words. You should see my own writing. It's just like a collage. Like, so many other people are better writers than me, so like, why would I say it in my own words? But I don't have to, you know. Borrow liberally, yeah. Box quotes, anything like that, that's fine. So, just make sure that you always explain your quotes. So, point out to me why you're using them, stuff like that, right? I like to like piecemeal, like where it's like you intermix your commentary inside of other people's words. I like doing that a lot. I just think it's fun. But okay, other questions about? Come in. Just making sure I get you. Okay. Well, today we're going to talk about colorblind racism. This is going to be the main focus of today. If we get time, we might look through one of the chapters of Collins briefly, but otherwise we'll stick to colorblind racism. I gave you a pretty short reading, really, right? One of the shortest we've had so far in class, by somebody named Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who kind of created this concept of colorblind racism. It's short, but it's kind of dense. So I think kind of the thing to do with the article is to kind of go through it slowly with each other, kind of piece by piece. So, okay, so pulling up, any reactions to this article so far before we jump into it? Anything you guys want to say? Thoughts you have, questions you had in reading it? Oh, by the way, I didn't say the name of it. It's When Whites Love a Black Leader, Race Matters in Obamerica. So it's obviously a little bit of an older, it's an Obama-era article. I actually just assigned it because I was curious what Eduardo Bonilla Silva would say about Obama, so yeah. Reactions on the surface, anything at all? What did you guys glean from the article? I'm just gonna wait.
I don't know. I was just curious to see how, like he talked about Iraq and Afghanistan and how he moved troops. Did he mean to like relate that back to like the social, like racial like scene in the United States with that? I was just kind of confused.
Yeah. So that's one thing about this article is he points to a lot of things, right, that you may or may not be familiar with as discussions of race, right? And this is a good one. So in terms of the military, he nods at something, and this is something that's been around since the civil rights movements to some degree. Who disproportionately serves in the military? This isn't usually how we envision the military. But which populations do you think are actually usually in the military? There's a couple of them in the United States. Particularly people who get the like really grunt, not very pleasant jobs in the military. let's start with in terms of social class. Who usually ends up in the military?
Lower income.
Yeah, lower income people. So if we're talking about the United States, which racial groups do you think disproportionately make up the military? African Americans. So like often there's sort of this like weird thing that like when we go out and we fight in foreign countries, disproportionately it's a disenfranchised population. And we could also extend that to marginalized whites, right? But also like African Americans disproportionately are the people who die for our country abroad. So often like military engagements are kind of caught up in this weird thing. That so you know, even back like Martin Luther King often talked about pulling people out of Vietnam as a race issue, right? And so Benea Silva is kind of, I think, when he talks about that, indicating the same sort of thing. So, other questions of that? So that's a good one. That's a good detail to pull out. You guys just want to start with the beginning of the article? Okay, let's do that then. Okay, so I'm going to start from the very first paragraph. And so he starts out by talking about, and this kind of picks up during the halfway through the article, where it says objective indicators. Do you guys see where I'm at? This is right underneath where he cites Steinberg. If you're just looking visually. It doesn't have any significance. You guys see these objective indicators? Okay, can I get a volunteer to read this aloud? And make people read today. I know it's 8 o'clock in the morning. Discussion classes at 8 in the morning. We planned this, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Is it just starting at objective and?
Yeah, let's start. And I'm going to stop you periodically.
Objective indicators show that many of the country's racial outcomes are still mired in a pre-civil rights mindset. The separate and unequal fallout from Hurricane Katrina.
I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause in between each one of these. Okay, so we're starting out, right? So he's going to start talking about objective indicators of what? What is it? What are these objective indicators of? And what does he mean by that, do you think? Those are my two questions.
Stuff you can measure that shows examples of racial inequality.
Yeah, that's basically what he's saying. He's saying that like we still have racial inequality, and here are a variety of things. And if you look, it's like a laundry list of things that people have written on, right, and shown are racially unequal, right? So, and this is just keeping in mind context. So anybody know? So the first one that he names off is this incident happening around Hurricane Katrina. Is anyone familiar with what happened in terms of race in Hurricane Katrina? You guys, does anybody here remember Hurricane Katrina or know what this is? I see some nods. What happened in Hurricane Katrina? Just broadly, what is it?
It was a disaster.
It was a disaster. Anybody know what city it hit?
New Orleans.
New Orleans, yeah. And so, does anybody know what happened after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans?
Everybody had to leave.
Everybody had to leave. Who actually got to leave?
Some people.
Yeah, essentially people in wealthier neighborhoods were evacuated. Everyone else had to wait, right? There was also just like these weird things about reports about looting, which actually turned out not to be true. But there were unarmed police officers, or ununiformed police officers roving the streets with weapons, and it sort of feeded into this weird feedback loop, and they sent the military in, and it was a big deal. So quite a few people got shot who were unarmed and just sort of like moving through the city. You know, it took weeks to get people actually evacuated out of the poor black neighborhoods, right? It was generally considered a major failing, right, on America's part. Right? But it showed this sort of divide that people were perfectly okay to have large portions of the black parts of New Orleans just left unevacuated, sitting on their rooftops of buildings that were flooded out, right? Yeah. So that's essentially what's happening, right? That's what that's indicating. Okay, let's keep on going. There's a laundry list of things that show inequality.
Voter disenfranchisement.
Does anybody know what this is? Voter disenfranchisement. What's voter, I see a nod over here.
Laws put, or certain things put into place to hinder people from being able to vote.
Yeah, does anybody aware of voter disenfranchisement for African Americans, some of the forms it takes? So you get things like prison disenfranchisement, right? So there's laws in several states that prisoners cannot vote. Who disproportionately ends up in the criminal justice system? Black people and Latinos, right? So what does it mean if you're talking about, it gives a different one down further, right? That 7 times higher incarceration rate for racial minorities, right? So who's 7 times less likely to be able to vote in the United States? Minorities, right? You have other laws, so we're going to look at some things like gerrymandering later in the class, right? Where you redraw districts to exclude people so that their votes don't count. Happens widely across the South, is happening increasingly right now, that keeps African Americans' votes from being counted, right? What else? There's other forms of disenfranchisement. There's things like purposely placing polling stations so far away from that people who don't have the ability to drive don't get to vote, right? And who does that disproportionately hurt, right? So actually, like, in a lot of ways, specifically African Americans, but also poor people in general in the United States, are often kept from voting, right? So this is and like purposely so. Like, it's not that this was just accidentally drawn up this way, or that people passed these laws with the idea, without the knowledge that it was going to disproportionately affect African Americans. It's a specific law put in place to take away African Americans' right to vote. Right, so that's what I'm referring to. This has been going on in the country for a long time. Does anybody know when African Americans gained the right to vote in the United States? The 1860s. Right? What almost immediately happened after that was they started to put things in place to keep African Americans from voting. Right? So African Americans there's a long history where African Americans gained the right to vote, but have never actually been allowed to use it, right? We actually had our first black elected officials at the federal level in the 1800s. We wouldn't see this again until the 1960s and 70s, right? So you think about that, right? So like there's a long history. This is things like in the past it was things, and even like there's talk about bringing this back, making people answer questions at the door to prove that they're literate before they can vote, right? Which was something that essentially like was done to allow people the discretion to keep African Americans from voting. So this is that's what that's indicating. Okay, keep on going. We already talked about the incarceration rates. Now let's skip over that one.
Persistent and growing wealth inequality.
Which we've kind of discussed before, right? Keep on going.
Residential segregation patterns and housing discrimination. So
still to this day, there's a lot of housing discrimination. People residentially are excluded from certain neighborhoods. This, even though like technically this is illegal, a lot of times, and I've even known realtors that say that they do this, will not show certain properties to African American couples out of fear that it will lower the housing values in that neighborhood, right? Or that they won't be able to get other people into the surrounding houses as easily if African Americans live there. Right? And this is actually common practice, even though it's illegal, right? To the point where, like, it's documented that there is, right, clear racial discrimination in housing. Okay. And this happens in little ways. Sorry, I had a family that I was friends with. We went to church together that were Puerto Rican, and they couldn't get housing. I had to work really hard to get them housing. I had to help them because essentially, like, they would show up and people would call immigration on them or something like that. Is there an irony to that? Does anybody see an irony to that? Puerto Ricans are what? American citizens, right? But because they came and the father only spoke Spanish, right? There was like this like weird thing that people just like completely would like even call the police on them to get them arrested, for looking at an apartment, right? So here you get like very subtle ways that this continues to happen. Okay, go ahead.
Pre-Brown school desegregation levels.
Yeah, so segregation in the United States has actually increased since we undid Plessy versus Ferguson, not decreased. So we're actually more removed, African Americans and Caucasians are actually more removed from one another than they were before, right? So even though on the laws, there's nothing to make that happen, right? Socially, it still occurs, and that's what he's pointing to here.
Racialized jobs, or the colorblind gutting of Brown versus Brown Board of Education.
And so basically what he's pointing at there, and we'll get into what the colorblind term means, right? Well, education is still used as a major mechanism for separating people out in the United States, right? What schools you go to, how likely you are to get into college, right? What college you go to when you get there, all these things are ways of separating out populations and reinforcing class over time, right? And still is to this day. Particularly pertinent for those of you who are education majors to some degree, right? Like, this is still a problem. I say that because, how many of you guys are education majors in here? Yeah, this is a class where we get quite a few. So, you know, okay, keep on going.
Racialized job discrimination and exclusion from white job networks.
So yeah, and once again, this is like a social thing, and it often isn't even acknowledged by the people doing it, right? One thing we should also point out is like, and I try to point this out as often as I can, when sociologists talk about racism, they're not talking about people. They're not talking about racists, they're talking about institutions, right? Institutionally speaking, our job networks, how we get jobs, how do most people get to work? Do people know this? Through what? How do you find out about jobs? What makes you more likely to get a job? Social networks. Most people are employed by people they know, or friends of friends, or something like that, right? So there's like these informal things that sort of guarantee that African Americans don't have, right? People who aren't connected into these social networks that employ having more wealth and privilege, people don't have access to those closed networks, right? There's also subtle cultural differences that make a big difference, right, between groups of people. So he's pointing to that. Like I said, it's a bit of a laundry list, but I think it's actually really good at setting up, he's setting up, racism is a very big problem, right? Objectively speaking, in the United States still. Okay.
The predatory racist distribution of subprime mortgages.
Does anybody know what that's a reference to? Subprime mortgages were these things that caused the financial crisis. Do you guys remember? Of 2008, right? You guys know what this is? The banks gave out bad loans, basically. And there's a whole history of why this happened that I don't really want to dig into. But essentially, banks started offering loans that they were worse loans than they ever were capable of offering in the past, right? And disproportionately, these were given to African Americans. So what happened in the housing crisis is who disproportionately lost their homes? African Americans, right? So this is, I know this feels a little repetitive, right? Because we already have the conclusion in place, but he's going through a series of things that, to some degree in the social sciences, are generally considered, right? These are generally known things in the social sciences that everybody accepts to be true. So you're looking at, the literature has shown, right, that all these forms of discrimination are still very much so in play. And then the last one is a bit poetic, right? But essentially what he's referring to is, does anybody know in addition to this, right, we also have the fact that hate crimes have been on the rise for the last 30 years in the United States. Right? So, and look, we're talking about, since the 1980s, there has been more hate crimes in the United States consistently over time, right? So that's what this reference to nooses is, right? So people are more likely than they were 20, 30 years ago to be subject to racially driven violence, right? And this isn't talking about the police stuff that we are very familiar with because of what's going on right now. This is literally just everyday citizens, right? Which was where the Black Lives Matter movement actually started. We'll talk about the Black Lives Matter movement later, right? But with George Floyd. the shooting of a young man in Florida, an unarmed teenager. Right, and what his point is he's pointing at that when you take all these things together, it's really hard to make a claim, even though most of us feel this way, right? Most, in particular, I mean most of us, as in most white people feel like the civil rights movement happened and racism is over, right? And even just if you poll people, empirically speaking, most white people think that this is the case, right? Objectively speaking, it is not. Right? So that's his point here. Objectively speaking, we live in a society that is just as racist as it was before the end of segregation. Right? So all those things we learned about that, in essence, sound like, that we learned about in school that like became this period where African Americans became included in the system, right? What Vanilla Silva is pointing out is like, objectively speaking, that hasn't been the outcome. Right? No, you're good. You're good. Sorry. So let's, and then yeah. So I'm going to leap over this part about some of the NYPD and who they stop, and so let's go to page 177. And let's take that from that little paragraph. I'm going to get somebody else to read. I'm not going to make you read consistently.
The one that starts with the black image.
Yep.
The black image in the white line is still based more on a consensual white hallucination than the objective findings presented above. As the research traditions of laissez-faire racism, symbolic racism, and my own work on colorblind racism shows, whites have learned how to talk the talk and walk without walking that walk.
Yeah, so what's he saying here? Because he's pointing to something very specific that has changed, right? Yeah.
Is he kind of saying how like whites have been talking about moving towards a racist free society, but actually don't do anything about it with actual actions?
So one, yeah, objectively the actions haven't changed, right? But what has changed? There's one thing that has changed since pre-Brown versus education, pre-segregation, or during segregation, right? Pre-civil rights. What's changed since the civil rights, according to Vanilla Silva? What have whites learned to do?
Talk about the problem.
What's that?
Talk about the problem.
Well, it's not that they learn to talk about the problem, because it starts with this that they that their image of what blackness is a hallucination rather than based on objective reality. Go ahead. You had your hand
I
up.
think they've learned just how to, I guess, just kind of go around the actual problem and act as though, where they've learned how to make it seem like it's positive or, doing better in racism, kind of showing your support through different things, yet the underlying actions in the problem isn't actually changing, and they're not getting to the actual core of what African Americans have been going through. They're just kind of overcoating it with just a bunch of positivity.
Yeah, and that's basically the idea is. So this is the central idea of colorblind racism, is that we deny the significance of race. And we often do this by, and this is kind of the weird thing about it, by being polite. So white people have a tendency to be very polite about race. They have a tendency not to openly say racist things anymore, right? I think if you were to take an example of something that is like a good example of colorblind racism, it's like, have you ever heard somebody say, "I don't see race," and they deny whether they can tell that somebody is another race or not? Right? Sort of like, "Oh, I don't see the difference." Right? You ever heard anyone say this? It's a very common thing for white people to say. "I don't see color, I just see ... Right? I just see people, I just see whatever, right? Is that ever a true statement? No, no. When people can, like, we are trained from the time we're young to tell what race people belong to and to categorize people on the basis of that, right? Like, it's thoroughly in our society, right? It's thoroughly entrenched here. So when we make that claim, what are we actually making a claim to? What are we trying to do? So when white people say that, what are they actually trying to do?
They're like trying to make themselves look good.
Yeah. Yeah, so in a weird way, Benia Silva is trying to say that basically race has become this thing discursively, right? Objectively, it's kind of pretty similar to what it was before, but discursively, it just becomes this way of white people showing how polite and good they are. Right? Which in a lot of ways reinforces racial divides, right? It allows us to sort of like indicate our own moral superiority over others, right? And that's really kind of what has happened, right? So we learn to talk the talk, but we don't actually want anything to change. We want to discursively get rid of race. That's his point. Linguistically, we want to get rid of it. And this goes back to like, this isn't like, we have to make sure that we're not thinking in terms of racists, right? But racism, right? The point is like, white people feel uncomfortable talking about race, right? Why is that? Like, and I'm like, this isn't me like, I feel uncomfortable talking about race. I've just gotten used to doing it because I have to sit up here every week and talk about it, right? But it's not something that it feels wrong to me to talk about race because I'm white. Why is it that white people feel so uncomfortable talking about race?
Are they scared of saying the wrong thing?
So part of it is that they're scared of saying the wrong thing. What else is it? Why are we scared of saying the wrong thing? What do you think? Why is it that white people are afraid of saying the wrong thing? Shouldn't you use the inclusive we thing? Not racist. It's because we know. We know that there's inequality racially. But it doesn't look positively upon us, right? That it still persists and exists, right? It's a lot better to to essentially like if we can whitewash the world and treat it like nothing's happening, right? That reflects a lot better on us. Everybody tries to preserve a positive self-image to the world, right? And unfortunately, the way in which we do that is to deny really seriously entrenching problems that exist within our culture. So what Benia Silva is pointing out is this is if we want to understand racism today, we have to overcome this problem of colorblind racism. Because if things are just left the way that they are, if we assume that everybody's equal and that everybody has equal opportunity and everybody's being treated equally by the criminal justice system and that ... right, what will we inevitably do about race? What's going to happen to most minorities in the United States if we just ignore that these divisions exist?
Is it going to become more divided?
Yeah. Yeah, essentially what it is, and if we're talking about things like income inequality, African Americans are more poor compared to whites today than they were in the 20s and 30s. Right? So if you're talking about, right, racial divides in the United States, like they've increased. So by ignoring them, we just sort of self-perpetuate these problems over time. right? It's only by acknowledging them, right, and learning to talk about them that we can overcome them, right? That essentially, otherwise, to some degree, white people are just going to continue to oppress racial minorities. That's his point. Make sense? So another way to put it is like, systematically, things haven't really changed, right? But what they have done is they have become more hidden, right? So in being more polite about race and no longer having these sort of overt forms of racism that we had in the past, where like people would just literally, right, be racist, right? That doesn't exist as much anymore. Instead, what we have is we have quiet, insidious racism, right? Which just makes racism more difficult to identify and get rid of, right? So in a lot of ways, like, if you're looking at the world through the eyes of Benia Silva, things are objectively worse, right? But subjectively, we think that they're better. Make sense? Cool. Let's take the next paragraph. Who wants to read the next paragraph? Volunteers.
Ignoring all evidence of the profoundly racialized system affecting most areas of social life, and the fact that most blacks are still at the bottom of the well, whites have pointed to several token black figures as evidence that the long arc of white racism is indeed tilting towards justice. All of this further complicated our racial quagmire.
Okay, so what's being said here? Is your hand up, Ashley? Oh. Do you want to go anyways?
No.
What's this say?
Is it kind of saying, like, we take a couple, like, black people who have made it, like, really successfully and said, like, look at these people, they made it, so there's not a problem?
Yeah. Yeah, essentially that, like, what happens is, and this is often referred to as tokenism, right? So in essence what happens is that we often look at a small number of African Americans who became financially successful or changed class, right? Things in some ways aren't solidly closed like they were at one time, right? But statistically speaking, African Americans are worse off, but there's a handful of these sort of figures that manage to do a lot better, right? So this is the same way we often, when we deny the significance of social class, we do the exact same thing. We pull the token examples of people who, the sort of rags to riches story, right? We love this story. It's all over. We make feel-good movies about this and put them up on, like, I don't know, like Hallmark Channel or something, right? Like, this is a common story, right, that we have about, like, the person who started out with nothing and became, like, as wealthy can be, right? And we do this with African Americans, we do this with social class. Every time we do this, it sort of denies the significance of what happens for most people, right? It's just becomes a way of justifying the continuation of the system that we live in, right? Okay. So let's take, and this is where we get to Benia Silva's reaction to Barack Obama. Or at least when we start to. So, any volunteer to read this paragraph? Let's go with a different volunteer, somebody who hasn't spoken yet. Very patient. Yeah, take care.
And then, as Father Slater claimed in his memorial statement, out of nowhere came a post-racial apparition saying, "Hey, I'm Barack Obama." And the entire world, with Hillary, said, "Oh damn, where did you come from?" And almost miraculously, Obama became the nominee of the Democratic Party. I predicted something like this 10 years ago, and now that it is very likely he will be elected as the 44th president of the United States of America. We must ponder, were we all wrong? Were liberal and conservative analysts right when they claimed America had seen the end of racism, or at least the declining significance of race?
So what's Benia Silva's fear of what would happen as a result of Barack Obama being elected? We can get more details. Let's flip over to page. Still not looking at. Yeah. So. Wait a second. Sometimes I think my notes are going to be better than they are. Oh, right here on page 759. Oh, wait, no, sorry. I'm just going to make you guys jump around a lot. Sorry for the awkwardness. I'm looking for the spot where... Oh, right here. So, yeah, sorry, 179. So there's this bottom paragraph. So, just can't have it. It's a long paragraph, but I'm still going to try to get a volunteer to start reading. At some point I may make the switch. Who wants to read this time? It's a discussion-based class, guys. You gotta just jump in. Go ahead.
4? The one that starts with 4?
Yeah, and we're just gonna ignore the numbering, so just, yeah.
Okay. As Glenn Ford, executive editor of the Black Agenda Report, has suggested, there is a refusal to even listen to Obama's actual policy positions on the matters. The state of affairs, sociologically speaking, has elements of what we used to call a craze, although I believe the quasi-fanatic behavior can be explained rationally. Last and perhaps the most important factor behind Obama's success, and my biggest concern, is that he and his campaign mean and invoke different things and feelings for his white and non-white supporters. For whites, Obama is the end of racism and the magical Negro, a term from film studies who will absolve them of their racial sins. Obama, like John Coffey in The Green Mile or Lawrence Fishburne in The Matrix, gets to serve as the vehicle for white development. Look, whites can say, I am beyond race, I voted for Obama, or, of course I'm against reparations or affirmative action or welfare, etc. Obama made it, why can't the rest of you?
Okay, well, I'm gonna make you pause there. Or you can probably stop reading. But okay, so what's being said here? What's this paragraph say?
Like moving say they're not racist because they voted for Obama.
Yeah, so part of it, we're going to talk about, right here we're looking at the meaning of Obama for most white people, right? And it's, in some ways it allows them to sort of exist and perpetuate within this colorblind racism, which is his claim, right? Why is that? So they can claim that they're not racist because they voted for Obama. What else is in here?
Well, it kind of seems like they were saying that, like, Obama, like, he's not really, like, saying that he's gonna make it better for, like, black people. Yeah, so they're like, oh, is he even, like, going to help, like, racism?
Yeah, and this is actually, like, this was an issue that actually, like, largely happened around Obama, is that in a lot of ways, like, he wasn't particularly, especially if we're talking about Democrat presidents, he wasn't particularly good on race issues. So he didn't do as much for African Americans as even, this is why Al Sharpton calls Bill Clinton the only black president. Just kind of meant as a joke, right, when he says it, right? But like the point is that Bill Clinton was actually had a far more progressive race policy than Obama did, which is sort of strange, right? And actually, like, and this isn't like current politics, but Joe Biden wasn't particularly strong on it back before he was the vice president either. So like, there's sort of a weird thing happening that Bonilla Silva is trying to point out, that like, in some ways, because of the color of his skin, Obama is being treated very differently, right? And so it allows, despite the fact that he didn't really move us towards, in some ways, a more equitable race policy, the perception was amongst whites that essentially African Americans had made it, right? That it was fine, right? He compares this in film studies. So in film studies, by and large, in American movies, do we get a lot of African American protagonists? This is just sort of a... You guys know what I mean by that, protagonist, right? Is your main character usually black in a movie? Most of the time. Even percentage-wise, the same as the proportions of people in the United States. No. But that doesn't mean that, like in film studies is a big thing. This doesn't mean that we don't get like African Americans being casted positively, but they're often casted positively in these roles where they like are in some ways these sort of like grand magical helper figures that help white people achieve their goals, right? And so it's like this weird like racially like charged thing, right? This is what's being pointed out here. And Bonilla Silva wants to claim that there's actually kind of a weird link here between that figure, right, and how Obama is sort of treated, right? As if like we will be able to actually achieve, so in whites' minds we'll be able to achieve a post-racial society by electing a black president without ever having to change any of the systemic problems that dance behind American racism. That's his overarching point here. Okay, so somebody wanna take up from the second half of this paragraph. So he's looking at the divide between white reactions and black reactions to Obama. Other volunteers, yeah, go ahead.
Obama, the John Coffey, and the Green Mile.
We're sentence below that, so for some blacks.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah. For some blacks, Obama is a symbol of their possibilities. He is their Joshua, the one who, regardless of what he says or does, no matter whom he rejects, rebukes, or throws under the bus, he is and remains their man. He is the culmination of the long civil rights movement, evidence we are finally home.
Okay, so what is he claiming here?
Well, I think he's like claiming that like blacks think Obama is like going to help them, even though he's like not really saying like anything that he's gonna do.
Did you?
Yeah, pretty much what she just said, like Obama is just like their leader and he's gonna get them out.
Yeah, and so, oh, sorry, I accidentally cut you off. I thought you were done. Keep on going.
He's just gonna get them out of like this whole century of persecution and racism.
Yeah. Yeah, so in a lot of ways, like, his point here is that everyone had unrealistic expectations of what Obama, based upon what he had done in the past as the mayor of Chicago, right, and, you know, and his voting policy as a senator, and what he said he was going to do, didn't actually live up, right, to the claims, which we actually, I think, saw. It's kind of interesting because this is before he became president, right, and I think that by and large, when people discuss race in America, I think that what he predicted was largely, probably, for the most part, a lot of people would agree came true. So, like, you know, he's talking here about a lot of African Americans had the underlying assumption that Obama was going to help them as a result of him being African American as well, right? So, And if you look at this paragraph, we don't have to go through this one in detail. We look at the various ways in which Obama actually placed himself on the side of things that were not actually beneficial to African Americans, or that traditionally civil rights leaders would have wanted, right? But nonetheless, people sort of backed him. And I think it's kind of interesting in retrospect because, like, here we have, and how do most Americans remember? So, like, let's try to like talk about like. So now we're talking about past politics, right? Well, let's talk about the present. How do we think Obama affected race relations in the United States? What sort of things did people say about Obama when he was president? Particularly people who were really hostile critics of Obama. You guys remember some of this like weird racialization of Obama sometimes? There's like rumors around. People talked about him being a secret Muslim. You guys remember this? Right? Or that he was going to try to, there was another like conspiracy theory that like, he was going to try to hand our government over to Kenya. Right? These are just blatant false racism stuff, right? And actually, like a lot of like a current American politics can be understood as being like a weird reaction about Obama on behalf of white people, right? You get things like, you guys read this? This is something that just came out last week. Did you guys hear about the 1776 Council thing? The federal government formulated a committee, right, a council, that essentially oversees education to try to get racial inequality out of high school education in the United States. And this is just something that happened last week, right? Well, basically it was like anything that doesn't present America as a miraculous exception, right, shouldn't be taught in schools, is the claim, right? So like here, like you think about like I don't think before Obama's presidency we would have gotten open policies by the United States government that says, you know what, we should just pretend like slavery didn't happen and just get rid of it, right, from our textbooks. Like to some degree, this is almost like moving beyond colorblind racism into something very different, right? And what does that mean? Right? And how much harder, if, like you think about like teaching a class like this, how much harder would it be if none of you guys had ever heard of the civil rights movement before because they stopped teaching it in schools? Right? Like that's weird. So like there's a lot of weird things going on right now surrounding race, and I think that they're largely a reaction, to some degree, like white America reacted to the Obama presidency by, to some degree, getting a lot more racist, right? So we're getting more forms of overt racism. That's what I mean by that. So going back to like, I'm not talking about individuals, we're talking about structure. But I think we see our social structure actually moving away from colorblind racism and into something a lot stranger, right? You will hear people saying like openly racist things, like politicians saying openly racist things. This is something that like when I was in college never happened, right? This didn't occur. So in a weird way, like I wonder like to what degree, like, and it's often framed though as this like, why is it that we no longer have to talk about racial inequality in textbooks? Why can we whitewash over slavery? Well, the assumption is that it's because we now live in a post-racial society. Right? Or even like we take people's reactions towards a lot of the social movements that are happening right now. And a lot of it is framed in this sort of colorblind racism, right? It's just a denial of the objective reality of black inequality in the United States, right? So now we have this sort of like weird, like almost weaponized colorblind racism, even more so than I think Benia Silva was talking about back in 10 years ago, right? Well, that makes sense. You guys kind of see that? So like, we're still not overtly racist in the same way, but like, a lot of times we just deny the significance of racial inequality. And then we can just do that, right? Yeah, so that's kind of, I think like taking that into the present, that's kind of the significance of the Barack Obama presidency, right? Is that it gave us a good image of equality, right? But actually, like, in a lot of ways, created a lot of hostility, right? And now we exist in an even worse state than we did before. Right? Okay, so that's I think that's probably pulled enough out of the article. Any questions or thoughts that people have? Reactions? What do you guys think? What do you guys think when it comes to like overt versus discrete racism? What do you guys feel is happening in the world today? Do we live in colorblind racism? Do we live in something different? What do you guys see? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we live in colorblind racism. I think a lot of times, like especially with social media, it's easy for people to post a bunch of things about like hashtag Black Lives Matter, when in reality we aren't really doing much about the situation. We just kind of let this out sometimes.
Oh yeah, so you're saying that you think sometimes like people's support of movements is very superficial.
Like yeah, or
Yeah.
we just kind of everyone's super positive about like the change and stuff when
Other reactions or thoughts? Do you think that do you think white people feel as positively about the Black Lives Matter movement as they did about Obama though? So you kind of had a head movement. Do you have a thought?
I would say no, just because I feel like with Obama it was more like, I'm voting for him, I'm not racist. And with the Black Lives Matter movement, I feel like it's a lot more, like you're more in it, it's like more personal, I guess is the best way to put it, than just voting for somebody.
I do think that like sometimes the people who support it are, it's a little like, especially like if you're going out there and actively protesting, like, there's a lot of white people that go out there and actively protest with Black Lives Matter, right? And it can even be quite dangerous, right? So like, I don't know if that's like not walking the walk at that point. Do you have a different thought, Isaac? You had your hand up.
I was just gonna say that like, I would think there's a positive outlook on like the Black Lives Matter movement from a white person's standpoint until everyone started, for some reason, connecting the looting with the Black Lives Matter movement, and then everything just went like downhill for a white person's perspective. Because then that's when you started seeing everything like pop up on Twitter and Facebook, like why are these rioters looting their cities and all that. So I think there was a positive outlook until that started occurring, and then it kind of just, everyone turned their back on the Black Lives Matter movement. Not everyone, but I mean like, you got a negative outlook at that point.
Have you guys noticed, and this is just in terms of like political divides, that people who are supportive of the Black Lives Matter seem very doubtful of the looting stuff? Have you guys noticed this? You guys know like the history of accusations of looting? This is something that's actually kind of comes through. If you wonder why people get really dismissive about looting claims, it's because that like looting has often been used as an excuse to to essentially, like, this was also like the same sort of claims that were often being made about the civil rights movement back before, is the same sort of claim, and even like, you know, we were talking about like Katrina, right? Like, often claims of looting were used to deny whether African Americans should be helped, right? So it's like, well, they're all looting, right? Keeping in mind that like a lot of people are probably just stealing food from grocery stores because like they've been sitting on their roofs for a week. You know, but this sort of like, well, they're looting, we probably should just like it's, you know, they don't really deserve our help, it's dangerous if we go and help them, we don't want to send FEMA in, right? So like looting has a long history in the United States as being used as a weapon against African Americans, which is kind of tied up with our image of African Americans. Like most white people assume that African Americans are like more likely to steal, that they're more dangerous as a population, right? These are the sort of underlying white people's perspectives often, right? And so looting kind of feeds into that. So like if you wondered why like on one end of the political spectrum looting is like seen as a sign of like we need to stop Black Lives Matter, and while on the other end of the spectrum people are just like, well, whatever, that's actually a lie. Once again, this isn't, I'm not meaning this specifically politically, it's just sort of unpacking the symbols in play here. Yeah, so like, yeah, I do wonder like if it's the same thing, yeah, and I wonder like, is that the transition, or like, what's the place in Washington that got, I should probably hold off on talking too much about Black Lives Matter, we have something on social movements later. What's that?
Jazz.
Jazz, is that?
Chaz.
Chaz?
Yeah, when they took over a whole street.
Yeah, yeah. And once again, like I think too, like it's fair to keep in mind like different reactions to things. Like Zuccotti Park with the Occupy movement, right, did almost the exact same thing for months, right? Almost in maybe even years, where they literally like a bunch of white hippie kids camped out in the middle of Zuccotti Park, right, and occupied public space and didn't let people in or out of it, right? So like, but the reaction when Black Lives Matter did it was very different, right? And so getting back to like, in some degree we could kind of get this into like, so, and well, did anybody hear about the reaction to this? What happened as a result of them, of Black Lives Matter taking over the street?
I mean, it was there for quite a while.
Did anyone hear what we did as a government? The United States did. We, for the first time, sent out unidentified federal troops in unmarked cars and arrested people and detained them without trial.
They were marked. We were talking about federal troops, or they're not even troops. They're just federal agents.
Yeah, they were agents.
They had like DHS or so other stuff on there. They identify who they are. As for unmarked cars, they use unmarked cars all the time.
Yeah.
It's not like it's something new. Like.
Yeah, they were doing this before. They were using tactics that like border control in particular were using before. Yeah, it still is like a weird thing that you can't identify what agency people were with often. Or who the arresting officer was, yeah. Right? Like that was different.
There was like the video or whatever where people were like, this person's unmarked, and it literally had like border control on it. So it's just like,
yeah,
they're identified. People are just saying that they're not identified.
I don't know. I got to be honest. I trust my news sources, so I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not gonna like because it depends, right? Like what news? Unfortunately, in America, what news sources you read will determine what news you get, and it's often radically different. So fair enough. Like we'll wait until peer-reviewed stuff comes up here too, and then we can write. But unfortunately, yeah, like it's not so. But getting to the point is like, it's a very different reaction that they had towards Occupy, is my point, right? And I think that still stands. We didn't do anything that radical. We didn't respond to it the same way, right? And I think that that's telling, right? In the same way that like we literally 2 months ago had people standing in so this happened in my home state in Michigan. Did people hear about this? You literally had people bring AK-47s into the legislation, and we did nothing about that, right? And you make a comparison at like what's threatening versus what's not, right? and how we treat it, right? There is something very racialized about it, right? And that's not to say that like there shouldn't be any reaction to taking over a street at all or anything like that. So that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that the level of reaction that we get is very racially divided, right? And I think there's something interesting about that. Once again, you can completely disagree with me. So yeah, thank you for sharing your perspective.
I mean, I'd also say that the people in like Chaz, they were all carrying AKs too, so it wasn't, they literally just took it over like, yeah, you're not allowed to walk in here anymore, and there's a lot of violent crime going on. And I believe it was, I think it was the police department that went in there, just did orders in there, so it wasn't even federal agents that.
Oh, the police and the governor of Washington and the mayor of Seattle, not to like disagree with you, right? They all asked the federal troops not to be sent, or the federal agents not to be put in.
No,
They were also trying to descale at the time that the federal government upscaled it. I'm not trying to be contradictory. I'm just
saying they weren't the ones that
Yeah.
actually moved them out, because that would be illegal to begin with. Federal troops cannot, like federal law enforcement cannot go in there and move people out unless it's federal property. So it was the actual state / city that actually told them to leave.
Well, and I think what we're picking up on here, and I think it's really hard to talk about these things now, right? And I'm not like, and this is more just like, I read the New York Times and I, listen to NPR when I drive around town, right? And what's the news sources that you use?
I use varying. I don't really like.
Yeah.
I don't trust anything that's like cable news or actual journalistic stuff.
Yeah.
It's usually wrong.
So here we get what we get is we're getting like, and this is actually very indicative of conversations around race in the United States right now. Like, and this isn't, it's very hard for us to empirically talk about what's going on together, right? And I'm not meaning this like as a chastisement in any way, shape, or form. I like that you're bringing it up, right? But here what we're seeing is like, depending on where you get your information from, you will not be able to discourse with somebody else, right? And this is sort of a weird position that we're in right now. So anyways, yeah. Fair enough. So, okay. Other thoughts people have, or discussions they want to have. Time is it? Okay. I don't think we probably have enough time left to talk about a chapter in Collins. So I think we'll just kick that. We'll capture the rest of Collins next Thursday. Right? So we'll cover all 4 of those chapters. We'll do it a little faster. A lot of it's going to be repetitious with things that we've heard before, so it should be easy to do that, right? Thank you guys for debating with me a little. That was nice. Thank you, and thank you guys for talking. So remember, no class Thursday. So we're going to take our break. If you have. Do people expect that they will come in to ask questions about the course or come in to use the study hour? Can I just get like a show of hands if anybody thinks that they will? One person? I might not show up then. Is that okay? It's just really, it's 8 in the morning and emails work too. Yeah. So.